Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table. We discuss the issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendrick Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. And my guest today is Jurrita Williams, who is Student Body President here at Dallas Theological Seminary. And you're halfway through your term, I guess. So
yes,
how's it going?
It's going pretty good.
Okay. Keeps you busy?
Oh, my word. Yes, it does. A good busy.
Okay, that's
yeah.
good. And how far along are you in the program here at Dallas?
So this is my third year in the THM program, so I'm almost there. I see the light at the end of the tunnel.
You do see the light. Well, sometimes I ask third-year students, and they're not quite so sure if there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, I'm sure.
You're sure? Okay, that's good. Well, I'm glad you're living with eschatological hope. That's a good thing.
Indeed.
Yeah. So we've asked Jurrita in here because she presided over a student chapel that we had a few weeks ago, in which she walked us through her family background, which I think is interesting because we're going to talk a little bit about life as an African American in America, and a little bit about how within the church we can do a better job of communicating with one another, having come from different backgrounds and being of different races, that our oneness in Christ is something that helps to drive us together. And to work towards that and to do a better job of it, because our default doesn't necessarily mean that it works so well, and our history can show that. And so we thought a journey through that kind of history with a specific example, and then just a conversation between the two of us would be a good thing. We've been working together on these issues here on campus for a while, and then there's been an ongoing conversation between the Hendrick Center and many of our students about this. We're now, I think, well into our third year and having that conversation as well. So it's part of a larger discussion that exists on our campus that we think is an attempt to model in church context the kind of conversations we can have.
Yeah,
so
that's the hope.
Yeah. And we really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
No, it's my honor. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dig back. We're going to go back into the genealogy. So how, this is actually an interesting question to ask anybody. How far back are you aware of your family roots? I mean, how far back can you go?
Yeah. So on my maternal side, on my mother's side, we can go back 4 generations to my great-great-grandfather. And on my dad's side, we go back to my great-grandfather. So it's interesting because I do have a cousin who does a wonderful job with keeping us abreast of
every family has one of those.
Absolutely. And he is just amazing with just keeping the books and our genealogy up to date, so that we'll just know, where we came from as much as possible. But I think the beauty of it is, as a Black American who descended from people who were enslaved, we had an oral tradition that was handed down, and he took it upon himself to write it down for us from a cousin that continued to tell the story over and over again at every reunion that we had. And so he just did a wonderful job with making sure we had it written down so that people like me, cousins like me, could read it and could understand it. And my nieces can now take hold of that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
And, I wasn't planning to discuss this, but it's an interesting point. The whole orality aspect of how we pass on family traditions. I mean, because in our family we don't have there's no Bock book anywhere, but we had an aunt. We had an aunt who has traced the family on my wife's side back 15 generations.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and actually, back in the days of when Max first came out. Okay,
yeah.
So this is back in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, yeah.
Put together a series of 8 by 11 sheets and did a genealogical tree, which she had lithographed into a full thing that's on our back wall in our dining room, and with a little capsuled story for each person for whom she had information.
Oh, wow. That's pretty amazing.
So, it is. In fact, people walk into our house and they walk into our dining room and it's sitting on the back wall and they go, what is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tree like you've never seen before.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah, and it was all a combination of people who sat down and recorded these little snippets that you're talking about that were used to be passed on orally. So so that's fascinating. So let's talk about your family and which I'll let you decide whether you talk about your dad's side or your mom's side. You get
I must talk about both.
Okay, no, but which first?
I will talk about my mom's first. That's kind of how I entered into it for the chapel. When I was thinking about the genealogy, I thought about Christ, our Redeemer, embodied, right? And so part of my hope is that the embodiment of who I am as an African American or Black female, me being present wherever I am, whether it's in church, whether it's at DTS, whether it's in the grocery store, that the embodiment of who I am is a story of contemporary history. And so starting with my mother's side, so my mother is the daughter of Geston and George Gibson. George is the son of Morgan Gibson, and Morgan is the son of George Papa Gibson. And that's as far as I know that we can go back. And so
when you
George,
say Papa, you're at the top of the line. Huh?
No, I didn't know Papa Gibson, but that's who, as the story goes along, that's who they call him, because there were several Georges, including my grandfather. So to distinguish between the Georges. And so George Gibson, with a P, actually, was enslaved. And so he was sold from North Carolina into Hale County, Alabama, which is where I'm from. I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is in Hale County. But as slavery was abolished in 1865, around that time, he and Violet Hearns, he was sold into the Hearns, to Tate Evans in Hale County, Alabama, on that farm or on that plantation, and but worked in the Hearns community in Hale County. And so as slavery was abolished, the institution was abolished, they got married, and then they moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is where I am from.
So are we in the middle of the 1800s? How far back are we going?
About 1800s. Right just before the 1800s. So he was sold at 7 years old from North Carolina. And so we'd say maybe about 1780s up until the 1800s, I'm assuming.
So this goes all the way back just about to where to the founding of our country almost.
Absolutely, which I think is imperative for us to remember. It's not that far back, and I know it seems like we are an old country, but we are not.
No, you go to Europe. You go to Europe, and you know that immediately.
Absolutely,
you walk in the United States. Company since 1885. You go back to in Europe, and we've been here since 1053.
Or you go to Africa, countries in Africa, and you understand how. Just how young we are. And I think that's part of the going back through my genealogy is so important and imperative for us to understand, is because the implications are still being played out. So I think that's why it's important for us to kind of walk through it as a verbal embodiment of the history.
So this early generation, he ended up becoming a freedman, I guess.
He did.
Okay, and people may or may not understand how slavery itself worked. I've been to South Africa, where we kind of get on the other end of the story, if you will, and how people were literally, and this was happening around the world in different places, where people were literally being taken out of the context in which they lived, put on boats, and brought over, and they were regarded as more as property than as people.
Not more as property.
Not more. That's right.
Absolutely chattel. And so chattel is, capitalism. And so the commodity were black bodies. And so just remembering that the Imago Dei, for those of us who trust in Christ and believe in the triune God, the Imago Dei was was violated, and so on multiple levels. And so I think reckoning with that, helping us to understand that, we have to recognize that that's the history, that's my history, and that's American history. It's not just Black history, it's not just Jurrita's history, it's American history, and that we, I think as America, we can be ahistorical, and so that I think really clouds the way that we see the implications that play out in our contemporary history. And so just remembering the Middle Passage, remember the triangle of trade of Black bodies didn't just happen here in North America, but throughout the diaspora, we just happen to understand what the truth is about that, and how can we restore shalom to the shalom that was violated. And
of course, as I mentioned, this was happening globally. I remember I befriended this last trip to South Africa, got to know a African pastor very, very well who ministers in the Cape Town area. In fact, we've done his testimony here on the table. We haven't released it yet, but anyway, and he has done the same thing with his family. He's traced his family back, and in the midst of telling the story of his family and some of his relatives, there were people who are brought over from India into Africa with the same kind of, in the same kind of way. So it's we sometimes think this is just an American issue, but it actually was something that was going on globally. And that let's talk a little about the impact of this, because part of what we want to look at is the impact of what the historical story tells us. When people are treated not as people but as part of commerce, the problem becomes the dynamics of what that means for the relationships and for the families that are involved, because people are moved around and family units are not kept intact necessarily, et cetera. And so it produces a very socially disruptive way for a segment of our society to be living.
I think that's the part where I can personally speak into, because my great-great-grandfather, George Papa Gibson, was sold at 7. And so his mother, the story that we have is that his mother could only give him a thread and needle, a needle and thread. And so if you ever see us, most of the time, if we have a reunion, we have a needle and a thread on our shirts, because that's the only thing that he, at 7 years old, had when he sold hundreds of miles away from his mother. And so not only that, but his father had nothing that he could say about it, because he didn't belong to the right family, or he wasn't seen as a man, and so he couldn't save or lead his family. I think those are some of the things that when we're entering into evangelicalism, specifically white evangelicalism, and we have a certain structure of what a family should look like, we have to go back and look at what the institution of slavery has done for us. And so when we say that, it was a global institution, or as a global movement with slavery, or people being enslaved, we have to remember that, for America, we're the only unique country that was built on that kind of supremacy, that only built on enslaving an entire people only for the color of their skin, not because they were spoils from war or anything like that. Is because they were brought here for the very reason to be enslaved. That's it. So that's, I think, the difference that we have to wrestle with, and have to ensure that we understand the difference between any other country, I think.
So he was sold into slavery at 7, and then the other end of the story, I guess, is that he was freed on the other end. So there was a family. There was a family that came out of that process. So the next generation was?
So the next generation was Morgan. So he married Violet Hearns, and they had 6 children. And of those 6 children, Morgan is my great-grandfather. And so from Morgan and Leela Royster, they married, and then they had my granddaddy, George Papa Gibson. He just left us in 2009 at 92. And so the beauty, I think, of how God restores and redeems even out of an evil institution like chattel slavery in America is that we thrive. And so my great-grandfather had the opportunity to purchase land after he was free. And I think that goes back to how can the church look into some of the things that were taken from people, whole groups of people, not just individuals, in order to restore and repair those systems that continue to keep people like my family enslaved and oppressed. And so by the grace of God, even today, there's Gibson Town in Tuscaloosa. And there was a community that was set up by my great-grandfather, Morgan, and his brothers and cousins. They built a church, an African-American church, St. Paul, that my aunt still attends. And so I think that's part of the framework for theology that African Americans had, even though there were violations of their entire beings, they still praised and worshiped the true and living God. And I think that's a theology that we have to look at in order for us to have a holistic view of what theology means in America.
And we'll come back to this. But one of the interesting features of this is a little sidebar, is thinking through how far back a person's reach is historically. Again, talking about orality. You knew your granddad.
I did.
And so I imagine you probably had some conversations about some of your family with him.
Yeah.
And so he, as you said, he died at 92. So he goes back pretty far. And the people that he knows, they go back pretty far. So it's what I call the ancestral reach in orality that I had in my house, someone, she wasn't a relative, but she helped raise me, who could take me back to the latter part of the 1800s with the stories that they were aware of. And then my wife had a grandmother who lived to be just over 100. She could take you back almost to the Civil War, and with people she knew who lived then. I mean, so we it's what I call the reach, and the reach goes back sometimes a century or more. So it's an interesting feature of the dynamics of how this works. So so your granddad formed this community and was came out of a Christian background. One of the interesting things that we can get into, and that I think is fascinating about African American culture is the way in which hymns work in the life of people, and the types of things that are sung about, and the way in which God is addressed in the midst of the situation in which the African American community found itself.
Right.
So when you talk about worship in the midst of this, I mean, you're serious about that.
Oh, serious indeed. Harriet Tubman is one of my favorite people in history. And when I think about how she was a liberator, called Moses by the people who she freed, I think about people who are in my lineage. I don't have to go to someone like Harriet Tubman to be a hero for me. And so I remember how my grandfather, because I didn't know his dad, but how my grandfather sang and how he prayed, and that had to come from a lineage of picking cotton in the fields. My dad, the same way. Some of the hymns that they would line, they would call lining a hymn in the church, and there was a call and response that I didn't appreciate as much when I was a child. I wish I would have drawn out of my granddaddy more than I did. He was a quiet, kind of mild man. Didn't do a whole lot of talking about himself. I'm talking about George Gibson, my mom's dad. Didn't do a whole lot of talking about himself, but he shared some of the stories about what the white man did, and there was actually the man. And so there's this innate distrust of white people for good reason. And there's this, I appreciate my granddaddy because he remained AME, which was the church that he and his cousins and brothers built St. Paul AME. And
so for people who don't know what AME is, what is
African Methodist Episcopal. And that is a denomination that had to be founded because, Black people weren't accepted into mainstream majority culture denominations of church. And so there was a founding of or a building of that church with my great-grandfather Morgan and his brothers. And what I appreciate, though, about them passing on that lineage of salvation is that it just traces us back to what God calls us to do, and how Jesus gave the word to the apostles, and the apostles gave it to this lineage of people who continue to orate and continue to tell about this Savior and continue to tell about who Jesus was, and eventually it was written down. And so and every time I read the lineage of Christ as we're entering into the season of Advent, I think about my own lineage and how the embodiment of who we are testifies to the history of our wounds and our pains, and also of the victories that God did bring us through. But to see my grandfather and to hear the voice and to hear the words, and they still come back to me today on so many levels in Dallas, Texas, to hear those prayers that he would pray over us, how he encouraged me to enter into ministry. He believed that I could preach the word. He did not skirt around it. And so I think that the power that God brought us through, it just speaks to the grace of God, even out of the misery of a history of slavery. So
we're a few generations in here, and we've talked about the formation of this community, really, that your his grandfather was responsible for, or your great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
Okay.
Well, I would say, so when George Papa Gibson married Violet, they came to Tuscaloosa and established this community. And so those 6 children received land, and we still have that land to today.
Okay, so let's move to the next generation, and this is, I take it this is your, okay, I'm not sure whether we're to your granddad or to your dad. Let's talk about both of them, your granddad and your dad.
Okay, so on my dad's side?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on my paternal side?
Yeah, we can shift
no
gears.
Problem.
Is that where the story picks up, on the other side of the family?
On the other side of the family,
okay.
sure.
All
and
right.
So my dad was raised in Demopolis. Well, he was born in Catopa, Alabama, and raised in Demopolis, Alabama. And so my dad's dad is Robert Hines, and then my dad's mother is Lucille Williams Shelton. And so my dad wasn't raised with his father. He never knew him. He was raised with his grandparents. He was raised with Ike and Laura Williams.
Okay.
So Ike and Laura Williams were sharecroppers. More so Ike. Laura had did she have 12 children? So this is my dad's grandmother and grandfather.
Okay.
And so they were sharecroppers.
Welcome back to the table. We discuss issues of God and culture. My guest is Jurrita Williams, our current student body president here at Dallas Theological Seminary. We're discussing really Jurrita's family and her family history as a kind of a lens into an African American life in a way that helps us to understand some of the dynamics that we have faced and that we currently face in interacting with one another on the level of race in the context of the church. And we're thinking through just hearing the story and what that means, and as a way of gaining some understanding about the way in which the African American experience is different than the experience of many, and then how that impacts the way we interact with each other. So we were, I think, at your granddad on your dad's side.
Granddad on my dad's side.
Okay, all right. I'm trying to keep this in my head, which is
you did very good.
So let's say we were talking about sharecropping. So let's for people who don't know what sharecropping is, what was sharecropping?
Yeah. So in 1865, the institution of slavery was abolished. However, in Texas, it came a little later. But there are still ways to keep Black people continually oppressed and really enslaved. And so sharecropping was a part of that. The 40 acres and a mule that was promised to people who were enslaved, who were Black, were promised 40 acres and a mule. And some of them received that from the government. I think about 1 million maybe may have received those reparations. But at the same time, there were millions that did not receive anything. However, those who did receive those 40 acres were told that they would have to give that land back. And they had to move off of that land. And if they refused, or if they said that they wouldn't move, or if they were going to stand their ground, they were removed by the government. And so that land, they said, one of the first acts that Andrew Jackson, at the time, the president at the time, said that one of the first amendments that he made was for them to return that land to its previous owners. And so that started
so it was given and taken away.
Given and taken away. Yeah. And for those of us who understand autonomy of economics, land is definitely a part of that. And so owning the land for African Americans was imperative for us to start to build our own autonomy in economics. And so we spent 220 odd years enslaved, working the lands of white owners, white people who were enslaving people who were Black, and they were told that they had to give that land back. And so my grandfather ended up being one of those who shared the crops. And so the man who owned the land was a white man, and he had all of the supplies, and he had everything that my grandfather needed in order to work the land. And so he was being paid, but he would always be paid in imbalance. And so year after year, my grandfather was working to get out of this debt that he could never get out, or my great-grandfather was attempting to work out of this debt to get out of.
So in effect, he was, make sure I understand this, in effect, he was renting the supplies and he needed to raise, and it was done at a level in which he couldn't keep up with the size of the rent, renting the materials by what he was able to earn.
And also renting the house. So the home that they lived on was on the land.
So it was everything.
Absolutely. Their whole livelihood was on that really plantation still. And so my dad was one of their grandchildren that was raised with them, and they had 12 children of their own. And so they would work the cotton fields. And I remember my dad, one of the stories that I remember that he tells more often than the others is he remembered one year, at the end of the year, they picked 13 bales, and they were supposed to be paid for 13 bales. And the man who owned the property told them they only had 2. And so those are the kind of things I think that when we're talking about contemporary implications, had my great-grandfather been paid, had my great-grandfather come out of debt, been dealt with honestly, then there's no story that could be written that could have the trajectory of where our family could be now.
Now, I take it that the way in which this worked is that he said you only picked 2, but this became part of what he then turned around and sold, so that he got the remaining 11, if I'm doing my math right. And so it's a double injustice.
And I think back to what the Lord says in Micah 6:8 in the book of Proverbs, unjust weights. And these aren't just people who don't know or who don't proclaim to be Christians. These are people who are deacons in churches, pastors who continue to enslave my great-great-grandfather on my mom's side and my great-grandfather as a sharecropper. And so these are the implications of a Black American woman who lives with this story every single day of her life.
Right. Yeah. And you talked earlier about the distrust that sometimes exists, and that's where it comes from.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we talk in my family, we talk about segregation and integration, what that did, and we can move forward a little bit in that later, I guess. But we think about how we had communities because we had to communities of Black people who were doing their thing, we had our own banks, had our own grocery stores, we have our own businesses, funeral homes, because we were segregated. We were, it was the law. It was the law for Black people to not read. My great grandmother, Ike's wife, Laura, she never read. She didn't know how to read or write, but she knew the Lord. My dad, now that's an oral tradition my dad always talks about too. He said she may not have known how to read or write her name, but she knew the name of the Lord. And I think that those are the things that when we're walking through what theology is, when we're walking through what reparations should look like, we're thinking through the actual stories of people. We're not numbers, theories, and we're not monolithic either. My story isn't like everybody's story.
Right. Yeah, fair enough.
And so I'm hoping to help us as a church to really look at what God says, and to really look at people as people, individuals, as well as corporately, and really look at the systems, because that was a system that was done by the government. That wasn't something that just one or two people did. It was an actual system. Laws were passed in order to continue to subjugate Black Americans.
Yeah, I mean, our point in, of course, doing this is to put a face on all this, to become familiar with the story that I think many people don't and have never heard the side of, and who don't understand what stands underneath certain words. They may have heard about slavery, but to actually think about what that involved. They may have heard about sharecropping, but they may not understand what that actually involved. And here are people who lived through it. This was their daily existence. And to see this happening on a regular basis, and to watch it happen, and what that does in creating dysfunctional relationships, really. And so that's why we're telling the story. Okay, so I think we've got your granddads on both sides of your family covered. Let's go to your parents on both sides of your family. So again, mother's side or father's side, you get to make the call.
Well, I'll start with my dad, since I started with my mom, my mom's side first, and we landed on my dad last. Okay. So my dad, like I said, he grew up with his grandparents, and I'll start with the story actually of something that I just posted actually on my Instagram for Thanksgiving. I was just being grateful, and I took a picture of this log stack that my dad did, and he did this every year that I was growing up. He has a lot of firewood. In the back of our home, because he loves fire, and so do I. And I took a picture of that because it reminds me of his work ethic, which he learned on a plantation, really, from his grandfather. But that's the work ethic that has helped him and allowed him to be who he is today. And so my dad met my mom in Birmingham, Alabama. So my dad, his friend was dating my mom's sister, and they ended up meeting when they were picked up. And so when we think about this, though, I want us to think about the segregation that was in place at the time. My parents were, or my mom and her sister and my grandmother went to go pick up my dad and my dad's friend, who's now my uncle, or who's my uncle. And they were drinking still out of colored water fountains and white water fountains. Yeah,
now I may not look it, but I go back that far. So go ahead.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about this, my mom and my dad are they're courting, and they're having to court in a system that segregates them from people who look like you, and so they're not able to move as freely as you would as a white American. But they met, and my dad was drafted into, that they met while he was in the Army, but he was drafted into the Army, and so he went to Vietnam in, I think, 68 or 69.
Yeah, I remember the picture that you showed of him in his military uniform in the chapel.
And that's one thing I also wanted to just celebrate with my father and my dad. Many times when we think about veterans, we don't think about Black veterans. We don't think about a man, my father, who was drafted by government, who continued to keep him segregated. And I remember him telling this story about him returning from Vietnam. He said when he left, the signs were up. that colored restrooms, colored water fountains, white restrooms. But when he returned, the signs had come down, because he returned in 70, and then he married my mom in August of 70. And so I remember him saying the signs had come down visibly, but it was still an invisible, your place. So much so that he received a job. He got a job, not received it. He got a job at a meat packing company, and he and a white co-worker had gone to get lunch. And when he got to the establishment, they told the white man that he can get his lunch at the counter here, but my dad had to go to the back of the establishment to get his lunch. And so now, the laws had been passed. Jane Crow were supposedly to be abolished, but the invisible systems were still there.
I'm sure you know who Dorothy Burton is, who graduated of the seminary, and she grew up in East Texas, and she tells almost the exact same story about when she went to get meals, and that the white people would come in the front,
right,
and the blacks were at the back door, and that was how they were fed at the restaurant. So it's it's actually amazing to realize that it has gone on and is in some cases is going on that long, that it's still the case. I'm aware of numerous stories like the one that you've told, where here the whites go in the front door and the blacks are in a different place. So and the irony of that, of course, is the fact that here's your dad, as you said, drafted by the government, fought I take it in Vietnam. And fighting for the very freedoms that we're talking about, and this is what he comes home to.
And see, these are the receipts that I'm hoping that America understands, because not only is it the government, but the integration and the conflation, I think, of the government in religion and the government in Christianity. And I'm hoping that not just white Americans, but that all of us will have a firm understanding, a better grasp of the history, in order for us to point to Christ, in order for us to decentralize whiteness and to centralize Christ, in order for the body to move forward. And so I'm thinking about some of the missionaries and some of the theologians that we hail that enslaved people who look like me. And so my dad is coming back home to a home where in the world, he didn't have to be segregated. He didn't have to be separated. But when he returns home, he's returning home to a segregated Alabama. And I remember, this is only, about, 6 or 7 years removed from 1963, when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is jailed in Birmingham. These white clergymen, they're telling him, follow the law, follow the order. And the law at that time was, black people, you are still inferior. Black people, you are separate but equal. And I remember my mom we were just talking about this the other day, that separate but equal. When they were in their schools were in, outhouses sometimes. Their schools were, they didn't receive the same amount of funds. And that still continues today in our educational systems, And so what we have to remember is that this isn't something that's in the vacuum. Where we're living today isn't in a vacuum. This happened strategically and intentionally in order for a particular group to remain in power and a particular group to remain oppressed and subjugated. And so, when my father's coming back home into these systems, it's not far removed from, George Wallace standing in the door of the University of Alabama, 5.5 miles from where I grew up. And that was only 14 years before I was born. And so when we're thinking through those things, this is the subculture that Jurrita lives in every single day.
See, and I remember growing up and watching all that happen on television. I was in Texas, but we, the whole civil rights movement unfolded as I was hitting my teen years, basically, and just watching that happen and trying to come to grips with, and I did not grow up in a Christian home, but just trying to come to grips with the way people would treat other people, and there was a sense of there's something here that's not right. It's just there's something off, and so in the context of the church where we are, the great reconciliation passage probably in the New Testament is Ephesians 2:11 to 22, where you watch Jew and Gentile who had a history of great division. Gentiles tried to wipe the Jewish religion off the face of the map. And we're not talking the Holocaust here. This is back in the Maccabean War, and so. And yet here is Christ coming in and saying, no, Jews and Gentiles were designed by God in his program of salvation to live and work together.
That's right.
And I love there's a little Greek prefix. You're going to smile when I say this. A little Greek prefix, soon.
I knew. Yes.
It's coming soon, but it doesn't mean it's coming soon. It means it's coming together. And so so you're sitting here talking about how God can take broken hearts and meld them together with enough mutual respect and sensibility and sensitivity and listening and engagement that they actually do begin to work to come together and to see and respond to the things that are going on in such a way that the whole body of Christ is affirmed.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's an important part of the overall story to think through that and to face up to the fact that there are things that still go on that are reflections of what has gone on, because most people have made a move, I think, in their minds that we have moved out of that, but and it's one of those we have and we haven't. Some things have changed. Science came down, but some things have not changed. The separation still exists.
Absolutely.
And so that's part of what's important in thinking through the awareness of what we're talking about here. So we're talking about your dad. What about your mom? You've mentioned her in some conversations. So I take it you all have talked a lot about this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Well, see, this is the experience of me growing up in Alabama, growing up with parents who was not afraid of our history, who's not ashamed of our history, who made sure my siblings and I understood exactly who we are and where we came from. And so I have a mother who loves history, and I have a father who loves history and appreciates where we've been and where we are now. And I just wanted to say about my parents courting in a system that really would try to keep them apart. Really doesn't celebrate Black love. Really doesn't celebrate being married. And you have to remember too that in the institution of slavery, it wasn't even legal for Black people to be married in the system of government. And so just remembering those things and God bringing my parents together is, I think, it's a beautiful tapestry of His grace and His mercy. But yeah, I remember George Wallace standing. Or I don't remember, but George Wallace standing in the door. But he also, for his inaugural address, said that segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And that reminds me of Scripture. It reminds me of Jesus Christ today, yesterday, and forever. And so my parents are growing up and they're right there in Alabama. It's not like that's something that's removed. And so my mother, when George Wallace stood in that door of the University of Alabama, my mother was going to Stillman College, which is an African American or HBCU, a historically Black college and university. And those were established because we couldn't get into University of Alabama. It's not because we weren't qualified to get into it. And remember, it was illegal for slaves to read or write. And so the qualifications, see, these are the systems that can keep you out.
Exactly.
And so the qualifications to get into a University of Alabama, of course you couldn't get in because the educational system was imbalanced. And so my mother went to Stillman College. And she ended up, when she was pregnant with me, she ended up going to the University of Alabama, and she got her graduate degree, or second graduate degree, actually, when she was pregnant with me. And so I think about that, and I think about my mom and how she loves education, how she made sure that my siblings and I did well in school, and she got that from her dad. Her dad and her mom, they made sure that their children, my granddad worked, I think about 40, I think she said about 47, 48 years at the particular trucking company that he worked for. And he made sure that every time tuition was due for my mom and her sisters and her brother, that they had their part. And my mom does the same with me. When I ask her about DTS and how am I going to get to the next semester, she said, well, where's your part? And so, I think the tradition of working, the tradition of you have to do your part as well, is definitely instilled in us. But when we think about that, we have to also think about the systems that intended to make sure we didn't get an education.
Right.
And so that's, like I said, 5.5 miles. I grew up from around the corner from the University of Alabama, and my mom had a significant part in who we were in understanding those significances.
You know, it's interesting. We're rapidly running out of time, which is a little bit unfortunate. But it strikes me in many ways how fortunate you've been to have the kind of pedigree that you have that persevered in the midst of all the things that we've been talking about, which wasn't the case for many.
Exactly.
And so the way the structure worked is that a lot of people got beat down in the structure, and in a way that was not healthy and didn't allow for the personal development and the personal flourishing and the way in which they could contribute their full potential, not just for their own lives, but for the sake of people around them. And so, Jurrita, I really do thank you for coming in and telling us your story. And we've actually, I'm realizing we only got a part and bits and pieces,
sure.
but they are significant bits and pieces. They're tasty morsels, if you will, of what's going on. Yeah. And I hope that people sense the kind of conversation that we're having that puts a face on what we're talking about, and it's part of what we're doing on campus. It's part of what we're trying to do to help understand one another and create a kind of mutual understanding and respect for one another that allows us to show our oneness in Christ. So I thank you for helping us do that today.
Thank you, Dr. Bock. I appreciate it.
And we thank you for being a part of the table, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/thetable. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.